from personal experience. I know that Michelle loves her dogs, Melody and Pippin, mountains, and cooking. You want to just give a quick hi and wave, Michelle?
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, there we go. That is Michelle Windling. All right. Zina Yaya is currently the director of policy at March for Our Lives and has a background in community organizing, youth engagement, and policy development and analysis. She has been part of the gun violence prevention movement for the last 4 years and believes that every young person should have a voice at the table. Thanks for being with us, Zina.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, and lastly, but certainly not least, is Michelle Ming. Michelle Ming is the political director at United We Dream Action, which is the largest immigrant youth advocacy organization in the country. She managed electoral and advocacy programs on reproductive rights, gun violence prevention, and democracy reform at the federal and state levels before joining United We Dream in October of 2021. Michelle was born in Indiana to Chinese immigrant parents, spent her childhood in China, North Carolina, and Texas, and now lives in Brooklyn, New York with her cat, Geraldine. Thank you for being with us, Michelle.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's get this panel started. And I think I'm going to start off with you, Michelle Ming. I just want to, do a quick sort of, maybe the question that everyone's trying to think about right now. What happened this election?
Wow, what a profound question. What happened this election? I think we're all still trying to figure out or wrap our heads around exactly what happened. But like you said at the top, JP, what didn't happen was a total Republican takeover, which is amazing. What did happen, broad strokes, is that we saw young people turn out at like record levels, one of the highest rates of youth turnout in the past 30 years in a midterm cycle. We know that people of color turned out at record levels for Democrats as well as young people. When you look at the numbers, it's clear who is winning these elections for the people who are staying in power. And it's clear that there's like a mandate that young people and people of color are bringing to our leaders in office. It's also clear that people are not just like showing up for candidates and like, but they're also mostly showing up for like the issues that they care about. We saw things like climate justice, immigration justice, abortion justice, gun violence prevention, like come through as like key motivating factors for people to come out and vote this election season. So we saw a lot of like really, really exciting things that we can build on momentum wise going into big presidential year in 2024.
Absolutely. And, that's sort of the next milestone ahead in the electoral realm of how we might be mobilizing. Michelle, number two, Michelle Windling, I want to ask you, Michelle just told us about issue-based organizing and how young people really came out to, organize on issues. And one thing that we know is that the Democratic Party in power right now sort of passed its first ever federal climate bill and did all of these other things too with student debt and these other issues which have been thought of as young. What else do you want to add to what Michelle said about what happened this election?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything Michelle said is so historic and huge. And something that I'm really taking with me is, like you said, JP, we just passed this huge climate bill. There's been a bunch of work on student debt. The point is that when young people have been invested in, that's when we turn out. And what's so cool about these record numbers of young people turning out across the country is we did so pretty much across the board, but particularly in places where there were candidates running on progressive platforms that had solutions to gun violence, that talked about immigration reform, that had solutions to the climate crisis. Those were the kind of candidates where our generation was turning out in troves to get out the vote. And I think that sends a huge message to the Democratic Party that when they run candidates like that, young people are excited, young people feel invested in, and that's what actually is going to help more and more Democrats win 2-1, which is what we're seeing in places like across the board where there were progressives running, like Pennsylvania and whatnot. So that's really huge. And then I think the other really big piece of that is that it's not just on like the federal level, progressive policies that were able to be passed through Congress or through Biden. It's also on local levels as well, where we've seen investment. Pennsylvania, worked really hard and passed the whole home repairs that was basically a Green New Deal for communities and for housing. And that's where we saw a ton of young people feel energy and excitement to organize. So it tells a really cool story, I think, for all three of our movements too, of the connection that we can build between our local organizing and the federal wins that we're able to achieve too. So I feel so stoked about that.
That is truly riveting. I definitely feel a lot of that excitement too. And responding to some of the big names that have been in the news recently, one of those sort of doesn't pick between the sort of headlines of Gen Z and the headlines of progressives, because there's a candidate out there, a progressive candidate, who is the first Gen Z member of Congress that is actually coming out of one of our movements, March for Our Lives. And I want to turn it over to you, Zenit. What can we learn about what happened in this election? How are you viewing this, especially with someone as Maxwell so close to you?
Yeah, we were super excited, obviously, to see Maxwell Frost win his race. And I think for obviously our movement, folks who are close to him, friends, coworkers, colleagues, but also for Gen Z overall, right? I believe he's like the first Gen Z candidate to be elected into Congress. And I think what this shows me with this particular election is that not only are young people turning out to vote, right, in record numbers, but we're also saying like, hey, do your job or we're coming for it, right? Like that's really what the message that we're sending, especially with Maxwell's win. And I think I'm looking forward to, and I'm optimistic that, he'll be the first, but not the last, obviously. And we're going to see hopefully more and more of that because, we've even seen through our movement, just even at the local level and across the board, even candidates at the local and state level running for office, other Gen Z folks that are young in their early 20s, right? Flipping certain districts even. And so I think that this is obviously a great trend for our generation. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, especially going into 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that, no one likes being on the other side of I told you so. But for once, I do think that young people are on not the receiving end, but actually the delivering end, where not that long ago, big political leaders in the Democratic Party were shunning us and wagging their fingers, saying you are naive, you are out of touch with the rest of this country. And yet, despite all of that finger wagging, a lot of young people showed up, and it was often those progressive policies and that sort of communication of need from our movements, that sort of coalition that our movements built with a traditional party structure that has been really alienated for a really long time or out of touch for a really long time. It did kind of wondrous things, right? It sort of gathered the support of people who were already there, right? And who have been there for years, maybe generations past, but it also mobilizes constituencies or groups of people that have either been forgotten, discounted, or never really reached out to, of which those are, our generation, folks of color, progressives, and communities all across the United States, which have been really forgotten by the Democratic Party. So I think that, the three of you sort of waging your power right now and sort of showcasing to a party apparatus that is really blind to social movements and young people that there is a need to listen to us that is strategic in order to save democracy and make life dignified and safe for all people, is something that we are now going, I told you so about. And that's truly something that's really inspiring. So sort of piggybacking off of that, and I want to toss this over to whoever first wants to answer it, but many of you have worked on the ground or in the sort of war rooms of these elections, right? What do you think the Democratic Party should learn from this moment and the last few years about what works for how to win and why we should be a part of that?
I don't mind kicking us off, I guess. just to kind of sum things up on our end, we actually even did a bit of polling around this leading up to the elections, in terms of just like the issues that young people are caring about, like what's bringing them out to vote, what's bringing them to the polls, right? And it's things like climate change, gun violence, right? Immigration reform. And I think the thing to what we've already kind of touched on a little bit, the Democratic Party can learn is being bold pays off, right? And we are really the future, and like really taking that step to support really bold, aggressive policies, aggressive in quotation marks, I'll say, because we don't find them to be aggressive, right? In terms of the establishment, that's what the case is. And the fact that like youth aren't satisfied, young people are not satisfied with what the current establishment is giving us, what the current Democratic Party is giving us. And not only has data shown this election has shown this, and I'm sure we'll see this for the next few years to come, is the bolder you are, you'll get our vote.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the other piece that we like can't forget is there has been such a looming threat of this far-right extremist party gaining more and more clout throughout the country. And we got lucky in a lot of these races, right? In places where progressives ran, where young people turned out and voted hard and we won. There were other races where it was so much closer than it should have been between a Democratic candidate and one of these really far right candidates. And I think exactly what you said, Zenit, of the Democratic Party has to learn that running on those specific policies that are going to actually invest in our communities and make our lives better is what's going to make more people turn out to vote for them. And this is the election where it proves people of color, working people, young people, those are the people that are already engaged and inspired by those issues. And there's this whole array of folks who have been forgotten by the system that in a lot of really scary cases tend to go towards a far right candidate that wouldn't do that if they were invested in by Democrats. And that's, I think, what all of us in our generation have been screaming from the heavens about. And the risk is just too high for the Democratic Party to keep kind of like waffling between whether they're going to run on progressive policies or if they're going to like try to see if like moderate platforms work. We don't have that like ability for them to kind of like waffle anymore. It's too dangerous. And I think that's like what we proved this year of if they run in our favor, we will help make them win. And that will defeat this like very scary party too.
Yeah, totally. Echoing everything that Zena and Michelle said, I think like we're far past like the we don't have time anymore for like Democrats to just be like, oh, let's try a moderate platform for the 15,000th time where we like pass out the same bland talking points to like every single candidate and see like if just being inoffensive to people like gets them to the finish line. I think what we're looking for is just like concrete policy solutions. We also did message testing at the beginning of the cycle, where we asked people about like immigration policies, but also like making the connections between like immigrant justice and just like fulfilling basic needs, like being able to afford college, being able to like not be evicted from your apartment, things that like affect people on a day-to-day basis, that connect to these like larger issues that we're all focusing on and that affect our lives. But we like also want to make the connection for people who aren't like making those connections themselves in their day-to-day to say like, yeah, like you're like the crumbling infrastructure of your house or like the mold in your house is directly connected to like housing justice and to the like climate justice initiatives we're working on. It's connected to like, things like that. So we need the Democratic Party to like try a little harder to like connect things for folks, not just take them for granted. Stop talking in talking points. And also like another thing that happens every cycle that really, really frustrates me is the fact that like the Democratic apparatus will like pull out of races preemptively or prematurely that really need like critical support, like at the point where they need critical support. And I'm thinking of places like Texas 15, where we lost that race in South Texas to a far right Latina candidate that's like spurring this narrative of like people of color, especially Latinx people, are like voting Republican now. And that was because the Democratic Party pulled out really, really early. And so I also need them to like stop doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's something that I definitely feel as someone who, comes from Miami, a place that's, a lot of that old beaten party infrastructure is calcified and dried up and is incredibly out of touch with voters, and is leaving just a whole gamut of people that have been felt, tossed aside by Democrats already, sort of in the vulnerable hands of any far right fearmonger who can weaponize their identities and absorb them into, a complete party of vitriol and hatred for their common neighbor. And that's really sad. And I think that that sort of showcases the need for Democrats to go on the offensive. Now, I want to give you all a shot to speak about your issue areas and how they played a role in this election. So Michelle Ming, I'll come back to you because I know you alluded to some of that. I want to start off with Michelle Weindling. Was climate part of the midterm election this year or not?
That's the question, JP. I think what we've seen from tons of polling and from conversations in the field with a ton of young people is that climate change is on their mind all the time. It's one of the top things that our generation feels fear about and wants to place their vote around. And so I think for our generation, yes, climate was on the ballot. Climate was one of the big factors that helped young people decide after a conversation with an organizer, I need to vote in this election. I think what is a failure is that in this election, less and less candidates felt that visceral need to have a really, really bold climate platform. I think that comes back to a lot of what Michelle was saying of the Democratic Party pulling out of these really, really tough toss-up races and candidates feeling like they were scrambling for what issues and platforms they needed to do in order to appeal to people. And so I think that's a lot of work that our movement, that Sunrise can do, is telling the story of the climate crisis and helping our communities see the connection between climate and government, and that the votes that we take are a direct result in whether or not there's going to be solutions to the horrific climate disasters that we're constantly seeing. Our generation doesn't need to be reminded of climate disasters and the climate crisis. We're living through it every day. Here in my home state, we're dealing with horrible air quality and wildfires into the winters because it's so bad here. I know over in JP's neck of the woods and others, hurricanes continue to devastate our communities. And the fact of the matter is, our generation has never forgotten the drumbeat of the fact that we only have a few years to find real solutions to this problem. It's really up to the Democratic Party to ensure that this isn't just something they use as a talking point when it feels like the pressure's on, but they feel a deep, solidified commitment to it being a focal point of everything that they do and each candidate for how they run as well. And that's what I hope to see more of. I think we did a good job as organizers of doing that in 2022's election. But I do think that it's a party failure that we can help put the pressure around to make sure that we don't run into something like that in the future.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think the critical intervention that was made by, Sunrise Movement is tying, climate not only to, or what is the way that we need to mobilize around climate, but, telling the story of climate change as one that is rigged against poor people, and that is rigged against people of color, and that is rigged against any prospects of a fair economy. And that story really needs to be told over and over again in many different iterations. I'm thinking of particularly this election, the supposed, red wave was to be driven by the fact that Democrats were in power at a time of inflation, of massive inflation. These sort of raises in prices were tied to rising oil prices and price gouging by the fossil fuel industry. An entire Republican Party that wants to keep us dependent on fossil fuels for years, allowing not only the destruction of our planet, but also the destruction of our pockets and every financial well-being that our families have. Is that the sort of party that you want to go for? Is that what Democrats want to acquiesce to? Or do you want to continue building progressive climate legislation that is going to free people all over this country from an industry that is not looking out for them and doesn't give a shit about them at all. And so I really like the fact that both of you have talked about making these connections and having a party that is willing to go on the offensive with these connections and step on some toes that need to be stepped, because frankly, the American people have wanted such toes to be stepped on for a while now. And frankly, no party has been there to do that. And so it's, that's truly inspiring. So Zenit, I want to turn it over to you. What role did maybe your organization or merely the issue of gun violence play in this election?
Yeah, so I think I'm a statistics person and like a data person, so maybe this comes across nerdy, but it's a really unfortunate statistic. I believe since basically the last election, which it was in 2020, firearms is now the leading cause of death for young people, so people our age. And I think that paired with, of course, everything that happens every day and the gun violence people experience every day, to a lot of just, the mass shootings that we have witnessed media highlight and elevate this year, from Uvalde to Buffalo to everyday gun violence in different cities. I think young people have been and are currently, fearing for their safety. With some of the polling that we did, a lot of young voters, I believe over half of them, feared for their safety from gun violence and believed that like at some point, if they're already not a victim of gun violence, they will become a victim of gun violence, which is so really, really sad that like, as a young person, you're thinking about your future and like, this is part of that. Like, oh, will I become victim to this? Will I lose somebody? Will I be directly affected? And so I think that issue paired with, of course, like all of these other issues. And also like, I think the other thing that really worked well for our organization, I think just overall for the youth movement, is the collectiveness of different folks coming together. I know we had different coalitions like Youth and Gov that I think all of our organizations were a part of. We did a lot of on the ground organizing with different groups, right? That did gun violence prevention, but also a lot of intersectional related work, right? Like how can we help folks that are working on climate change or reproductive rights? Like where can we overlap and kind of go after candidates who are like great on both issues, right? And so I think for us, those were really, really big, important things to be able to not just obviously get somebody who's good on gun violence prevention, but also most likely they're good on a lot of these other issues as well, and make sure that, we're kind of joining forces to fight for those candidates. And we did see that in a lot of places like Wisconsin, Michigan, right? Just to name a couple, even just taking aside the federal piece and focusing on the state efforts and being able to like flip a lot of those seats and, have trifectas.
Yeah, absolutely. And that piece right there, sort of thinking about what sort of opportunities, possibilities have been opened by, or what the outcomes on those sort of opportunities are given these elections, is something that we're going to talk about. But before we do, Michelle Ming, I want to give you an opportunity if you want to add anything that you weren't able to mention before about how migration and maybe United We Dream factored into this election.
Yeah, similar to a lot of, what Michelle and Zenit have said, I think that like young people and our immigrant communities are constantly thinking about like their day-to-day livelihoods being deported, not being able to just like access basic things because they don't have papers. And we're also in the unique position of like, a lot of our folks just like literally can't vote because a lot of undocumented folks are disenfranchised in this country. So we're also thinking about the ways to mobilize the people that can vote on behalf of people who can't. So I think in a lot of ways, like we saw immigration like literally on the ballot and like ballot measures that just passed, which are really exciting. But also we saw like candidates like last minute scrambling to like meet with DACA recipients like in the last days before elections, like in Nevada and in Arizona, which, is a start, but it's also like going back to the broken promises or like the failures of the party that Michelle was mentioning. Like immigration is a longstanding failure of the party. And so we need to keep that momentum up. But I do want to just shout out in Arizona, Prop 308 just passed like 2 days ago for the final votes came in. So undocumented immigrants will finally be able to qualify for in-state tuition in Arizona. That's something that United We Dream Action contacted 700,000 young voters in Arizona about in the final vote. The final margin of victory was 60,000 votes. So I think we did a little bit of work there to make that happen. And then also in Massachusetts, question 4 passed, which now means that undocumented folks can finally get driver's licenses, which, in 2022 is great. But it's also like, there are so many states that that's not the case. So we have to keep working. But we see in these cases, like when candidates talk about immigration issues, also like John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, was so vocal about his wife's story of being a formerly undocumented immigrant. We had a lot of candidates share stories on the trail of like their family members being DACA recipients or undocumented. So I think it's becoming like Democrats are realizing that they need to really like talk about that issue a lot. And voters definitely care and show that at the polls in various ways, but we need to, keep that momentum going when people actually get to office.
Absolutely. And that's really amazing that those measures passed. That's really great, because I think what it does is, at a time when not only young people, but young people especially feel that our sort of political agency, our ability to make a change isn't really worth anything. Sometimes all it takes is for us to be able to see something good, even if it's just one thing, to actually continue holding out some hope, and beyond that to being involved in some way, shape, or form. And that's incredibly important, because we're at a time when the Republican Party has been overtaken by incredibly far-right, anti-democratic ideologies that want to close the door of democracy behind them. And we might be having a very different call right now if movements like ours and, community organizers all across the country didn't discipline themselves to that form of hope. And to that, we really have to thank them and be in solidarity with them. Because democracies, well, first of all, to be completely candid, was always an incomplete promise in the United States. But even the little bit that existed is, being not only chipped away at, but sort of hit with the sledgehammer. And so any ability to sort of safeguard it and try and build it up is really important. And so that brings me to sort of this next part of some of the questions that I want to ask, which is about outcomes, right? So the first that I want to ask are sort of at the big level, right? These were thought of as like large, sort of federal elections, right? We talked about senators, we talked about Congress people. We're going to get to the local stuff and state stuff after. But so now we know that what we know is that Democrats have held on to their majority in the Senate, right? Now there's still a runoff race happening in Georgia between Herschel Walker and Reverend Raphael Warnock that could, add another seat to the Democrats, and also in doing so dilute the obstructionist vote of some other Democrat in the Senate. But what does the reality of having a Senate captured by or maintained by Democrats, what does that mean for the prospects of a lot of things? Or what are the good sides of that?
I can start us off. I think it's looking pretty unlikely that Democrats are going to win the House. However, what we know about the House is that throughout a cycle, it wavers with a very small majority that would be held by the Republicans. There is a chance that in a legislative session, we could actually have enough people voting in our favor that the House could push forward bills that are in the interest of young people, right? We know that that's a possibility. If we were to win the Senate in Georgia and hold the majority with that extra seat, it completely weakens the power that someone like Joe Manchin holds, who has historically been our nemesis when it comes to pushing forward progressive policy. And it's not as black and white as it seems, like the Republicans taking control of the House, it's still a wild defeat for them that they're going to have such a small margin to do so. And that means that there is still opportunity for federal legislation for us to push forward. And having Warnock as a senator would really, really help us with Manchin and Sinema. It would change the game basically for how politicking happens in the Senate, and it would really make it possible for us to push forward legislation that matters for our generation. I think the other piece that all of us working on elections are still thinking about, no rest for the wicked, is that 2024 is coming and 2026 is coming, and neither of those are promising maps for the Democrats when it comes to the Senate. And federal legislation isn't everything. I think that we have proven in this conversation, and we'll do so in a little soon also, about how important it is to do local organizing. But the reality is this really is our election cycle to maintain some power in the Senate and to make sure that we continue to seize the momentum of people who are elected to office, seeing that young people are who put them there, to feel accountable to us, so that they are protected in these upcoming election cycles where they're even more vulnerable than they were this cycle. And that's going to be really promising, not only for legislation, but for them to invest in our generation, and the combination to equal, hopefully, really progressive legislation, hopefully passing. So I feel excited about that piece. And I think it's just like a really, really big part of our organizing strategy as movements to think about the ways that after an election, the organizing and base building that we were able to achieve, how we can use that to our benefit to organize our communities and also to organize those federal representatives we elected to pass forward the legislation that our communities deserve.
Absolutely. That's really important. And I think that's really well said. Another thing that I'm thinking about too is that even when we, one of the things that I've been thinking about is particularly how much student debt or the cancellation of student debt mobilized young people and felt like something that, was listened to. And the fact that, a court run by a right-leaning judge was able to just completely wipe away, or not wipe away, it's still iterative, there's still stuff moving around, but was able to, pause that yearned piece of action by loads of people all across this country, right? And so I think it's also super important that, that now that we have that we're able to maintain a Senate, that we're also, paying attention at the scopes of elections more broadly in the scope of democracy as well, in terms of how, we are able to really take notice that the Republican Party is leading many of the attacks against democracy by trying to own the court system all across the United States, from the highest court, which struck down Roe v. Wade and essentially robbed millions of people all across the country from a right to their own body, to something like the cancellation of student loans. It's something that has to be mobilized and stopped. And without the young people and loads of people that came out to, keep the Senate this year, things might be looking very different as well. Now, Zena and Michelle, is there anything that you wanted to add about that question to the Senate? All right.
I would think Michelle summed it up pretty well, at least on my end. I don't know if the other Michelle has any.
Just really quickly, JP, on the point of courts, I think this is another opportunity where like federal legislation really comes in to play and is really important for us. On the immigration front specifically, I'm thinking about the fact that DACA remains like forever in flux, and is currently being challenged and litigated in the Court of Appeals, which puts like millions of people's futures at stake in this country, and something that we're really excited about, even like before the new Congress comes in, but like definitely when they come in, is like really pushing for a permanent path to citizenship. And that's something that I think the other, like one thing that is like, yes, there will be a Republican controlled House probably, But it's not like we don't know what the Republicans are going to do. They've said over and over what they're going to do. So we just need to be like ready to come out and fight them. Like Kevin McCarthy has said, like, if I take control of the House, like we are not going to pass stuff on immigration. But okay, Kevin, like challenge accepted. Like we can still come at you. Like it's stuff like that where like we can plan ahead. We can be like the Republicans have been for the past like 40 years and like be like 10,000 steps ahead of them. And that's something that I think our movements are really good at doing and have like been pushing the rest of the Democratic Party to follow along with, is like just be playing the game of politics like better than Republicans.
Absolutely. I think okay, Kevin might be the sort of tagline for the next 2 years. All right. So on that note, I think, the other thing that I want to move into is the fact that, this slate of victory, in many cases didn't only happen at the federal level. Actually, most of them, what we could call like actual victories, happened at the state or local level, where Democrats won several trifectas, meaning all three chambers of government, the governor, state senate, state house, in a couple states. So what fights are important in the next few years, not only at the federal level, but also at the local and state level, and how do your movements think of organizing amidst that? I'm going to give it over to Michelle Windling first.
Sick. Wow. Yeah. Feeling the local energy. I'm sitting in a district in Colorado where we just elected an abolitionist to be our House rep. It is so cool. And I think we are seeing so many more young people who care about these issues running for office too across the country. So that feels really exciting. I think what this has really proven this year is that, like you were saying, JP, hope is a really, really big motivator for our generation. And something I believe so fully in that Sunrise Movement is rooting ourselves in is really investing in communities and building opportunities for young people of color, working class young people, to root in the places that they live and fight for tangible changes in their communities that make their lives better. That's what builds power for us to be able to take on larger fights like we were just talking about in federal legislative environments as well. And that feels really exciting, not only for Sunrise to do that, to fight for a Green New Deal in communities, but to organize schools, middle schoolers, high schoolers who can't even vote yet, to still say that they are able to hold their school board reps accountable, that they know what they need as students in order for their communities to be better and to feel invested in, and that is possible for us to build as a movement. I'm stoked to see some school takeovers, some local legislation similar to what I mentioned at the beginning of this call of whole home repairs, like in Pennsylvania, things that really point to the Green New Deal working in communities that we can then seize the momentum around to build bigger plans for how we can make that a national scale program, how we can make the Green New Deal something that is delivered to every single person's doorstep, because a rep from their city council to their senator believes that the Green New Deal is what's going to make their community stronger. And I feel really excited for the organizing opportunities that Sunrise Movement is engaging in to make that happen. So, yeah.
That's incredible. I'm really excited to be a part of that movement as well. Zenit, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to add on to something that Michelle highlighted that I think is really important, and something that we talked a lot as an organization and with our movement about, in terms of like, I don't know if this would be the right phrasing, but like kind of like scaling up the work essentially, right? And it really starts at the local level. Change is super tangible at the local and state level, and also moves a lot quicker, right? And so be able to see a lot of these wins across the board at a local and state level was really important to us. Like, for example, there was a measure in Oregon that just passed last week, which basically is a permit to purchase for a firearm and also banning assault weapons essentially. And I think what is really important to highlight in those type of situations is you see states starting to, you have Oregon, right? And then who knows what's next, and who knows what states are going to pass legislation around that, right? And then as you kind of see these things percolate across the country, right? Eventually you're scaling up to like, hey, you know what? Like, the majority of the states have this. Like, why don't we just do it at the federal level? Or it kind of builds more backing around the specific piece, while also like we're starting to work in our communities where it's super important, where people are directly impacted, and we're kind of this nature of like, we're not waiting, we're just kind of taking the matter into our own hands and really figuring out how we can approach a lot of these roadblocks, right? Roadblocks as in the federal level, and when things don't move, especially with things like the filibuster and whatnot, right? How do we reorient ourselves to be able to still have tangible change and meaningful change, and also have an impact in the future on some of those things? So I'm really glad Michelle brought that up.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really important too, especially when we, like, if we're taking that into account. I think that the other sort of aspect of organizing or hope that is given to folks by the local level is that it's much easier to see the effects that you have immediately at the local level when you're organizing, sometimes more than at the federal level, where it might take years for you to be able to see that, right? And at a time when we need, folks completely bought in, and when we need folks to be seeing the sort of outcomes that their organizing is having, that is absolutely true, and feels really, really, really present for sure. Michelle, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Yeah, I think everything that's been said is totally true. And I think another thing that's really exciting is like when we're organizing, it's not only that people get to see like their work pay off as like these tangible policies, but it's also like a really great, I would think of it almost as like a leadership academy for the people who are like organizing on these issues. It's a really great opportunity for young people to like flex their organizing muscles for the first time, and like really be able to like fall in love with like the idea of like organizing and being in a community with people and like advocating for issues that they care about. It's like a crash course in like, like civics and policy and government. And so, yeah, I'm also really excited to give our young people and our membership like more opportunities to be able to exercise those muscles. Also, an exciting thing at the local level is like that like there are more opportunities for like non-citizens to be able to vote at the local level. We almost passed it this year in New York City. It's still getting litigated in the courts, but San Francisco has a measure where non-citizens can vote in school board elections now. So I think people who are not American citizens have just like more like direct like voting power at the local level as well. So that's really exciting for us. But yeah, Michelle, ever since you said school takeover, I'm just like thinking of all the school walkouts we can do. I know all of our organizations love a school walkout, so it's like getting my mind turning. But yeah, love local power. Local elections really important.
Yeah, it's really exciting, especially, at least one thing that I'm thinking of is like a lot of the organizing that, we have done as a movement at Sunrise over the past, few years sort of paid off certainly paid off in getting the first sort of climate bill across the finish line, as imperfect as it was. And now the sort of real fight is on how some of that money gets spent, right? How it comes down the sort of federal funnel to local communities and making sure that it's spent right. And, Michelle, I love what you said about, being able to have young people experience what it means to be in a community and lead it for the first time and sort of have this crash course. To me, the most beautiful thing about organizing in a sort of governance period at the local level is like showing people what it's like to govern ourselves, to make decisions for ourselves, by ourselves, engaging in the true work of building a culture of democracy that's meaningful, because we know how to spend our money. We know what our priorities are. We know how to care about people. We know who our community members are, and we know where the resources, care, love, fund, and work needs to go. And it's incredible hearing that all of you have, really awesome plans, and are still, grappling with new ideas and new inspiration of how this work going forward can be done. And, most certainly for the, nearly 130 people on this panel right now, that wouldn't be possible without immense amounts of volunteers who are committed to a vision for justice, for democracy, for the dignity and safety of all people. It wouldn't be possible. And so, if you're tuning into this for the first time and you maybe haven't done any organizing work before, or if you did organizing work, but you sort of burnt out, we've all been there. I think this sort of clarity of the moment, of knowing what we have for the next few years and knowing what our priorities are, gives us a nice and interesting slate to jump in on, right? And sort of recreate our priorities on, and make sure that we are going forward with some weight lifted off of our shoulders, with some mud cleared from, the onset of a pandemic, the sweeping of fascism, a complicated democratic majority in which we couldn't get everything passed. In many cases over the past 2 years, some of the benefits of that were really hard to see. And now that we're sort of grappling with expectations that were broken in good ways about how not terrible the moment is right now, it's sort of exciting about the prospects of our organizing. So I deeply appreciate all of you and the work, not only that you have done, but are going to continue doing over these next few years. So now I want to bring us to this sort of wrap-up question, which is truly, what is your closing message to folks on this call? What would you tell them? And anyone can start.
I can go ahead and start. I would say to everyone on this call, take the time to celebrate all your wins. That's one of the biggest things I've learned working in this, doing advocacy work and organizing work these past few years, is it really burns you out sometimes when you're really in it. But I think we have a lot to be thankful for and grateful for and to celebrate and be excited about, we've all talked about on this call. So take some time today to just be yeah, we fucking did that. And we're going to keep winning things because that's what we do as young people. We're we have the energy, we have the hope, we have the passion, we have the discipline to be able to continue to win for our communities. And everyone has said, we know what's best for us. So we're going to win for us. And speaking of ongoing work, Congress is now back in session because apparently they're going to do some work. So during the lame duck session, United We Dream Action is mobilizing. Thursday, we're going to be in DC, and it might be a little too late to sign up for that one, but in December, we're going to be back in DC to get some work done on immigration. So I would just ask everyone to follow us on all the socials at UWD Action. That's Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, if you're still there. UWD Action. We will drop some sign-up links for you to join us in DC the week of December 12th for our week of action.
I'll go real quick. I think in terms of just takeaways from this conversation, like Michelle said, I think we need to give ourselves a good pat on the back, take a breather, really relish in this kind of win that we're feeling because it's real. I think a lot of times, even for me, I'm just did that really happen? Did we really just do that? Is it's kind of surreal. And I think it's a really good example, especially with the last couple of years around, the pandemic and everything we've experienced, white supremacy, right? A government takeover, all of these things. It's really, really good feeling and a hopeful feeling, like we've kind of discussed, to know that, we're slowly trickling out and moving our way to the top, quote unquote, and young people are really coming out in the forefront. And also we're at March for Our Lives, obviously. Michelle, to your point, I'm oh, Congress is back, I guess. Cool. They want to do something, so we'll be there. We've been activating actually in DC this week and are going to come back in December with a bunch of other gun violence prevention groups around getting the assault weapons ban passed specifically, because we know that has made it through the House, and now we're just waiting for basically Schumer to give it a vote. And bottom line is we really want to see where people lie on the issue. And I think that that's really, really important, regardless of what the outcome is. We looking ahead to especially 2024, I think it's really important for young people and our like generation to hold a lot of these politicians accountable. And this is one way to go about that. And so you can also follow us on our socials, and we'll be posting a little bit more about that. And then also just looking ahead into 2023 and just thinking about a lot of the local and state work that we're doing. We'll have more updates coming out on that. We're really excited to be able to kind of like broaden a lot of our work and be a lot more intentional at the state and local level. So lots of exciting stuff coming on that you can follow us on social to learn more about. But yeah.
Thank you. And Michelle?
Okay, great. Hello, team. I think yes to everything Zenit and Michelle said. Young people are powerful. Young people can sway the Democratic Party to run on progressive platforms that invest in our communities. Elections help us build power on the local level, and we should keep investing in ourselves and working in elections, working outside of them for our communities. Speaking of winning, anyone on this call who's like, I want to keep winning, I want to keep helping, come with us to throw down for Georgia. We're going to be working really, really hard to make sure that the runoff goes in our favor. That's smvmt.org/GA runoff. You can sign up to help us there. And I think the biggest message is just, I feel so grateful to be in this work with people like Zenit and Michelle. This is what makes me feel hope and makes me feel like I can keep going when I feel really tired, is that we all just started out as a bunch of young people who felt scared for our homes and our people. And together, our movements are joining forces time and time again to make real change happen. And no matter what the stakes, no matter what the obstacles are, we continue to do that, and we will continue to do that. And that feels really, really empowering and inspiring for me too. So thank you, all three of you. We're just kind of a badass group over here. And yeah, I really hope that we can all, between the work that you two are going to hold down for us during this congressional situation happening and the work we're doing in Georgia, I think together we will continue building power in the short term, and then long term, there's a ton of work on the local level and federal level we're going to do as partners, and I feel excited about that.
Well, thank you very much to all three of you. It was truly an honor and an awesome way to spend my night hosting a panel like this. And I am excited for the era of American politics that movements like ours are opening the door of and letting an entire generation of people through. I think that we are truly on the precipice of what could be an era of dreams or nightmares, and all of that is dependent on the decisions that folks make about how involved and how hard we truly believe our dreams can be a thing. We have defied odds already, and we will defy them again. And I'm really excited for all of that. United We Dream, March for Our Lives, Sunrise Movements, some great organizations and movements to get involved with in order to build that place that we deserve and that government that we need and that dignity and safety that has lacked our community, has lacked in our communities, generations, and, you know, in our entire country for so long. So thank you, everyone who tuned into this. Have a wonderful night. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.